I grew up in England, in the north, in a place called Leeds. And when you grow up with parents from being a different country, a different place, you end up spending most of your childhood with an idea of what that is. So at family gatherings, birthdays, I was the kid sort of stuck underneath the table listening to the elders talking about some other place that I didn't actually know or had never seen. So I always grew up with this fascination of what that place would be, who these people were, and what my connection to them would actually be. Many years later, after finishing a first round of painting degrees in England, I decided that I wanted to come back to India, come back to this part of the world. And I was fortunate enough to get a scholarship that brought me to Baroda, and I spent 4 years there really involved in contemporary practice. But by chance, one of my teachers said to me, because I had this complete fascination with miniature paintings, which I found as a young kid inside the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I was fascinated by the color of these images, and I was fascinated by the language that was being used to make them. It seemed so different from the grey world of the north of England that I grew up in. And I wanted to see what that world was about, because it seemed to be, if you could connect the stories as a child to the images that I was seeing, I might have some kind of better understanding of what I want to do as a maker. So the first image, an image of a Pichvai painting. I came on this scholarship, and the idea was to stay at this university and paint for 4 years. Obviously, that didn't happen. I ended up meeting a master in Jaipur called Banu Vedpal Sharma, who was a master in the tradition of miniature and Pichvai painting. And I went to work with him at the behest of Ghulam Muhammad Sheikh, whose wife Neelama had worked with Banuji many years before and knew of my fascination with miniature. So she said to me, why don't you go and visit him? So as a typical student, I said, well, yeah, I'll go during the summer holidays, and I'll spend a couple of weeks, and I'll sort it out. I'll figure it out. It can't be that difficult. So I went to visit Banuji, and 12 years later, I was still living in Jaipur trying to figure out how this painting worked. One of the fascinations of that journey was the idea of working from a very small miniature painting to a large one, almost the size of this kind of screen here. This work alone is half the size of this wall. It's called the Maharas Leela. And the idea is that you learn not only the language of painting in terms of tradition, temple painting, you also learn how to make the colors, the cloth, the brushes, everything. And one specific form of that, the Pichvais, are very large cloth hangings. And they're used behind the deity of Srinaji in southern Rajasthan, in Nadadwara, as a stage set to the actual form of worship. And Pichvai means of behind. So the deity, the image is placed behind the deity is on kind of a pedestal, and they use these elaborate cloth hangings, paintings, as a stage set. It's a visual narrative, it's a yantra as well as a tantric image at the same time. It aids the devotee towards understanding the form of darshana, which means to see the deity and to be seen by the deity. So I spent almost 15 years working within this tradition. And then I got married. Life kind of changes. And I began to feel as though I wanted to more or less step back into more contemporary work. And what I meant by that was I was seeing things around me. I was sitting up as a father in the middle of the night with my 1-year-old who wouldn't sleep. And I was looking at his little toys that he had. And I thought, what if I took an ambassador, a little toy car, and I blew it up to that scale on a piece of cloth? What would happen? How would you play with a contemporary language using traditional methods and materials? What would that mean? So we come to the work of the Biennale, the actual project that I've done, which uses two specific things. One is the wall hangings and the idea of a textile hanging that refers to Pichvai, and the other one is miniature. When I came to live in Pondicherry, South India, I was lucky enough to retrace my family history. And I did a lot of what were called history paintings. One of them is called the baptism certificate, which I found in the records of an old church in Chennai, which stated that my grandfather was born and baptized in this church in 1857. And that was really a journey that opened up a whole vista of work. Because if you spend most of your life trying to find some other, and then suddenly you connect to other in a visceral and a real way, your life changes. Because suddenly you're no longer on your own. You realize there was something else. It was very real. And now I have something to prove it. There's his name, Peter Felix Lazaro, born 1857 in Madras, India. That began a whole body of work. And this brought me to my mum's story. I remember sitting one day with her and I said, look, what was it like when you first got to England? I mean, what was it like getting on a bus or a plane? So one day she told me the story. In the period of 28 days, in 1959, she went from a wooden house in Rangoon to a brick house in England. In the period of 28 days. Her life changed completely. And I was interested in that story and that narrative. How do you deal with the cold? How do you deal with suddenly being surrounded by white faces that you'd never been before? What would that be about? The work became a body called the Incoming Passengers. What I found was that they traveled on a ship called the SS Salon, and it traveled and took many passengers from Rangoon to Liverpool. And I found these ship's records with her name in it. And it's a typewriter hammers letters into a list. The colonial flotsam and jetsam. A girl moves from a wooden house on the outskirts of Rangoon to a brick house in the north of England. She is just one of the incoming passengers. This was the ship. I reproduced it for a show called The Incoming Passengers back in March in Mumbai, when I reproduced it as a 19th century oil painting, or that was made with actual natural colors. This was the ship's list itself. I reproduced it on a much larger scale. And what I was fascinated is that if you look at these passenger lists, they're just names of people, thousands of people, immigrants moving from one space to another, just hand-typed. Reams of them. I discovered 10, 20, 30, 40 of them. And I thought, what would happen if you reproduced it with gold? As if it's a manuscript. So you turn an ordinary, mundane object into something which is of a religious context, something which is outside of its own context. I was interested in that journey. When I delved into history and to the story, I also found out that my mother went with her family. My father, she was yet to marry, also went on the same ship. His mother also went on the same ship, and his brother went on the same ship. So the whole family had been on the SS Salon in a period of 5 years, and they only sort of got together when they got to England. What had happened is then, obviously they married, life went on, and one day, a couple of years ago, my father gave me an old plastic bag, and inside them were 9 cine films, 8mm, the old types. He just said, oh, can you do something with this? And they were archives that he'd made since 1960, arriving in England. And they became the snapshots of my life. So this piece of work that we're showing here at the Biennale is a homage to that period. It's snapshots of a life reproduced as paintings, but as miniatures. So on one wall you see a miniature, and on the backside wall you then see the hangings, the Pichvais. And I'm always interested in that dichotomy. And it's largely to do with how we understand contemporary art. With miniature, as a traditional craft, the paintings were made for courtly enjoyment. They were never meant to be hung on a wall. You take the miniature, and you don't place it outside yourself, you take it into yourself. Physically, the artwork enters you, and then you pass the artwork around over several nights, and you'd enjoy this piece of work. Then what happens in the modern period is that most art is out there. We enter an installation space, and then we fill the work, and we enter the work, and it becomes a part of us. And I've always been interested in the idea of how you can move between scales, between how you physically move in front of a work and how it moves you. These are some of the images of the cinefilm series, Caravan Holiday 1970. Just a snapshot of what it was like to freeze in the north of England, trying to have a sunny holiday when there's no sun. my family who went to visit the Queen, Buckingham Palace. It was a thing that you did. If you grew up in England, at some stage you would have to go and see the Queen. It's what you do. It's an odd little film. In 2015, I went back to Rangoon with my father. And this was the room that he grew up in. It was no bigger than 2 or 3 meters, 2 by 2 square. You couldn't actually get into the room because the door was slightly jammed. And it was full of a mosquito net and a bed. And I filmed this idea of looking down the mosquito net. And when the project of the Biennale came up, this was the only bit of information I had, was this 2-second video of looking back through a curtain. And I thought, well, it's almost like we look through history in the same way. It's almost looking through a lens in reverse. Nothing is as it seems. Things are slightly out of focus. The color of the film becomes tarnished. And as Toni Morrison says, the past calls out to the present, and the present distorts the past. We have to learn to live with that. It's a fundamental narrative that we have. We look at things and we kind of get it wrong. And I'm interested in how we reinterpret and revisit history. So the first work was that I took one of the films that my dad had given me, and it was one of the very first films in which my new aunt, who married my mum's brother, Edward, had met a young Yorkshire lass, and they decided to get married, and somehow my dad captured on film these two families meeting. And then you look at this film in 2016, 50 years later, and what you have is a kind of a historical document. History unfolds in a living room. If you're asking me, what is the Pichvai of my life? The Pichvai of my life is my mum's living room wallpaper. It was the backdrop. It's how within the nucleus of an ordinary moment, history just unfolds, unravels and separates, and fractures, and then something else comes out of that. And I'm interested in that moment. That moment, almost like Sudarshan talks about the idea of forming in the pupil of an eye. It's the behind and it's the forward. It's that bit where it all suddenly coagulates into one thing. And I was interested, could you represent that somewhere and walk through it? So this is called a portrait of Gail, made as a Pichvai using natural pigments, colors, the whole lot. That was the backdrop paper. This is from a still from the actual video with my grandfather playing mandolin. And I couldn't actually see the flowers properly, and it was kind of in my head, but I remember it vaguely, but I had to somehow figure out, how do you make wallpaper? So I spent months looking at 1950s wallpaper and trying to reimagine how the wallpaper would fold and unfold, and how would you make it actually work. And then I thought, if that's a first layer, what would be the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth? And when I came to visit the site space, and I felt it had this quality of being a wound in the middle of the belly of a ship or a whale. It seemed really intimate and quiet and personal, and I wanted to work with that, with these layers of history. So I took a few images from my grandfather's passport, and I reproduced it as a very faint embroidery where you could see through it. Again, you could see it could see you could see through it. And within the symbols of this is the symbols of empire. It's actually taken from the passport, so you have the Scottish thistle, you have the Irish clover, you have the Yorkshire and the Lancashire rose. It was a symbol of power, but reproduced as an ethereal, whispery object. So this is a detail of that object. And you look through it, and then you see an image of my grandfather and the passport itself. There's a reference to water. There's a reference to people who are dying within this water. There's an idea of a symbol of going north. These are the passages which take you further back through history. And I was interested in that as another kind of a layer. And then looking through that one, there's another layer of another theory, very small embroidery. And again, you're looking through this character, and this character is called Terence. He was my mum's cousin who got left behind. I was kind of interested, if you're going to create a narrative about where we are today in terms of the cine films, and then you, Gail, and then you go through my grandfather, what about the people who don't make it? What about the people we actually leave behind? Because it's not that the story stops. It just carries on in a different way without you. And we never quite think about that. We're always wondering where we are now. We don't think about what gets left behind, who gets left behind, and what does it actually mean. So I reproduced an image again from the passport of Terence. And it's the same sort of a scale. But it's an image of him at his graduation ceremony. And what was really sad about the whole thing is that Terence was an amazing scholar. He spoke several languages. He spoke Italian, French, English, Hindi, as well as Burmese, which is quite remarkable for the early 60s, in the fact that there was no YouTube to learn a language from. You really had to learn it. So he was a brilliant scholar. And the image of the hopeful graduate, and then there's a small portrait of what he looks like 30 years later. And it's an idea of kind of how we understand history, the things that we bring to it. And I wanted to reproduce it, almost like a medieval knightly portrait, completed with gilding. Square it in.
No, this line is okay.
This is how I made the final piece in the exhibition, which is a gilded icon. I've been working with icons for some time now, and I love the idea that they are symbols of religion, of power, the idea of gold itself, the gold standard. And they've reproduced a map in the middle of the gilding, and the words read thus: "These are to request and require, in the name of Her Majesty, all those whom it may concern, to allow the bearer to pass freely without let or hindrance, and to afford the bearer such assistance and protection as may be necessary, given at." It's a promise. It's a promise in a passport. It's a promise in my grandfather's passport. But it's a promise that today we've broken. We don't do that anymore. We don't let people pass from one place to another freely and unhindered. We don't afford assistance or protection. Thank you.